Great. Good morning. It's still morning or it's afternoon now? How are you guys doing? Great. Thank you so much for coming. What I'm really interested in when I look at stories is how stories and ideas and myths and legends, how they move from one culture to another culture. Because if we understand the stories of other people, what it does, it actually brings us much closer to them. So you have a sense of what we call empathy. Empathy is all about looking at the world from someone else's perspective, okay? So stories do that. Stories and myths and legends, they do that. And I want to give you a couple of examples. Does anyone know this particular boat? Who does that belong to? If you know that, put your hand up. Anyone? Which type of people does that belong to? I'll take it from the adults. Go on. It's from the Vikings. You heard of the Vikings? So the Vikings were in Scandinavia, right? So that's Denmark and Sweden and places like that. But do you know, there's actually more written about the Vikings in Arabic than there is in any other language. So in the primary sources, which is a primary source basically means that it was written around the time when those people were there, there's more written in Arabic about the Vikings than in any other language. And I'll tell you a bit more about that. Here's another picture of, this is actually, you probably don't know this, but this is a cathedral in London. It's like a big church, okay? And it's called Southwark Cathedral. And in the grounds of Southwark Cathedral is buried a Native American chief. He died there in 1736. Now, what was a Native American chief of the Mohican tribe doing in London in 1736? Okay? Anyway, just keep that thought with you as well, and I'll come back to that as well. Okay, so let me give you an example of how a story can come together. I was in this place, which is the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul. Has anyone been there to Istanbul? No one been to Istanbul? Okay, there's some people at the back. So the Topkapi Palace is in Istanbul. And I was wandering around the Topkapi Palace, and I came upon this item. And this is the staff of Moses. So this is the staff of Prophet Moses, which he held aloft against Pharaoh to part the waters of the Red Sea, etc., etc. You know the story. And when I saw the staff, I was scratching my head. I was thinking, how did the staff come to be in Istanbul? What was the journey of the staff from Egypt all the way to Istanbul? Anyway, I kind of forgot about that. And about 1 year later, I was on a cycling trip around this place, which is Hampton Court Palace. Hampton Court Palace is a palace in kind of southern, just south of London, like in a place called Kingston. And it was built by this English monarch, Henry VIII. Has anyone heard of Henry VIII? Yeah, a few people, okay. So Henry VIII was probably the most famous king of England. And I read at the time that Henry VIII used to dress up like a Turkish sultan. Okay, so he was around the 1550s. He's not dressed as a Turkish sultan in this picture, but he used to dress up like a Turkish sultan, an Ottoman sultan. And I thought to myself, why would Henry VIII dress like an Ottoman sultan? Anyway, when I did some digging around, I realized that during his time, the most powerful man in the world was Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent. He was the Ottoman Sultan, okay? And he was the most powerful man in the world. And what do we do as human beings? We imitate and we copy powerful people, right? That's why when, sports companies want to sell you products, they'll get some Indian cricketer to promote it, or they'll get Roger Federer to promote it, right? Because then when you see that product being promoted by someone, you think, oh, I want that as well, right? So you copy. So what Henry VIII was doing, he was a lesser monarch, and he was copying a more powerful monarch, Does that make sense? Yeah? Okay. So when I then dug around a bit more, I realized that after Henry VIII, his daughter, who was Elizabeth I, during her time, there were many, many things coming from Turkey and Morocco to England. So it's a very famous portrait of Elizabeth. Now, in this one, some of the jewelry she's wearing has come from Turkey. And the Sultan's mother used to send very flamboyant dresses to Elizabeth as well. And so she wore some of those dresses as well. And this man was the Moroccan ambassador to England in 1600. Okay. Now, he visited in 1600. You can see very distinguished gentleman. And not long after his visit in 1600, William Shakespeare writes Othello. And Othello is a play about a Moroccan, right? Now, I'm not saying it was directly related, but one could guess that possibly there was something going on. He was influenced, maybe. And Elizabeth, at the time, in 1599, she sent an organ maker. An organ is like a big kind of, like a type of, almost like a piano, which they put in churches. And she sent an organ maker called Thomas Dallam, who built an organ for the Ottoman Sultan. So he went to Istanbul and built this organ. And Thomas Dallam's organ was the first organ that was in King's College at Cambridge University. So he's quite a famous organ maker. So she sent him that. So I was thinking about this. I was thinking there's all this kind of cross-cultural exchange going on between England in the 16th century and also with Turkey and Morocco. And why was this? Well, what had happened is that England had become separated from Europe at the time because England was essentially a Christian country, but it was a Protestant faith. And most of Europe was Christian country, but it was Catholic. And the Catholics of Europe had essentially cut the English off. So the English in the 1590s, they didn't have any allies. They didn't have any international allies. So what they did was that they reached out to a number of Muslim countries. They reached out to Morocco. They reached out to Turkey to build an alliance. So in the 1590s, England's strongest international allies or friends were Morocco and Turkey. So I thought, this is really, when I was at school, no one told me about this. I didn't know. I studied all this history, and I didn't even know about it. And I thought, why didn't anyone teach me? Anyway, so when I was growing up, probably like when I was your age, then I would really enjoy reading stories that were about, swashbuckling, action, adventure, fast-paced kind of novels. That's what I really liked. So I thought, what would a story like Mission Impossible, but set in 1590, look like? That's what I started with. So when I started the novel, I thought, what would Mission Impossible in the 1590s in England look like? And that's the story I wrote, which is called A Tudor Turk. So A Tudor Turk is essentially, it's like a Mission Impossible story, which is that something's been taken, time is running out, and you have to get it back. And this is where the staff of Moses comes in, because the staff of Moses is actually in the story. And so the story is based across Istanbul, Alexandria, which is Egypt, Venice, and in London in the 1590s. Okay. So what I've just done there, I've just demonstrated to you how a story can be built. In other words, a story can be built from your experiences, right? Because what I've just shown you here, these were my experiences, right? I went on to these different places. I saw some really interesting things, and then I wrote that up in the story. Now, it might be that, the experience that you have is that it might be something in Abu Dhabi where you live, for example, or in Dubai or wherever you live, or maybe you go on a holiday somewhere in the UAE and you have an experience there and you want to write about it. And if you're lucky enough and you go overseas, maybe you get some experiences there, right? So when you travel is an amazing time to actually see the world and then come up with some stories that way. And particularly when you write about stories of people who are different to you, that builds empathy, okay? So that's kind of one example of how to write or come up with a story which is empathy, which is around travel and around your experiences. Okay, let's look at another way. You may actually have a really interesting idea. So for example, here's an idea. what if a boy living in the suburbs, okay, discovered he was part of a great wizarding family? So what book is that? Yep. Harry Potter, correct. So that's the idea, right? So that's the idea kind of behind Harry Potter. There's a boy, he discovers he's part of a great wizarding family. Okay. What if a young woman decided to sacrifice herself instead of her sister facing death? Well, that's kind of the idea behind something like the Hunger Games. Because in the Hunger Games, the main character, Katniss, she sacrifices herself to go into these dastardly games rather than her sister. So that's kind of an idea behind that. Okay, another one then. What happens when the world's greatest chocolate maker, he thinks about his legacy? What's going to happen next? What's that? Any idea? Correct, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, that's right. So that's, because Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, it's a story about Charlie Bucket, but it's also a story about Mr. Willy Wonka. Because Mr. Willy Wonka is thinking about what will happen to his factory once he's gone, right? So it's a story about Mr. Willy Wonka. And here's one I know certainly one person in the audience will know. What if the earth was so unstable that cities had to move around on wheels? Well, that's a book called Mortal Engines. And Mortal Engines, it was made into a movie recently, and it's a story set like 10,000 years into the future. And there's been this 60-second war between China and America. And now the world is so unstable that the cities can't stay in one place. They're built on these giant wheels, and they move around, gobbling up other cities. Sounds really scary. But that's the idea behind Mortal Engines, okay? Which is a wonderful story. I read that a long time ago. I strongly recommend that. So you may come up with a story based on an idea. So the first one I said it might be based on your experiences. I know you're all very young, but you still have lots of experiences in your life. And then you may come up with a story based on an idea. You could start with an idea. Another way you might come up with a story is based on characters. We often see people who we think, oh, that person's really interesting. I like the way they dress or how they talk. And maybe I could build a story around that particular character as well. So as a writer, there are two things you do when you think about characters. You think about what we call characterization. And characterization is, what does the person look like? How do they sound? What's their background? How many brothers and sisters do they have? Where do they live? So these are all the things that we call characterization. What does the person look like? But there's also another part of character, which is their true character. So who is that person like inside? Okay. Now, you only find out someone's true character is when you put them under pressure. Because it's true, right? In life, we all know that everyone can be really nice when everything is going well, right? Everything's going well, everyone's really nice. But when things get a little bit difficult or you're put under pressure, how do you react? And that's your true character. So as a storyteller, what you're trying to do in the novel is you're always trying to put your characters under pressure. Because the more pressure you can put your characters under, the deeper the revelation or the deeper the understanding of who they are that comes out in the story. Okay, does that make sense? Yeah? So you put your characters under pressure, and then you find out who they really are. So that's characterization. So I said one way of coming up with a story might be experiences, another one might be an idea, another one might be characters as well. So in my story, I've got two main characters, Will Ride and Ewa Mariam Al-Jamil. And Will is an Englishman who's grown up in Morocco. He was kidnapped when he was 5, and he's grown up in Morocco. He speaks Arabic, and he is, we find him at the start of the story on a ship, a Moroccan galley, and he's sailing, right? Now, his story is that he wants to get back to England. He wants to get back to see his mother. Ewa comes from West Africa. She's part of the Songhai nation. Has anyone heard of the Songhai? Okay. Songhai were arguably, they were the greatest African empire ever. So they were in West Africa. around the period of the 15th, 16th century. It's today in modern-day Mali. That's where they were. So their capital was Gao, and their intellectual capital was a place called Timbuktu. You may have heard of Timbuktu. So that's where they were from. So Ewa is from Timbuktu, and so she comes from a very sophisticated culture, really intelligent, very articulate. So Ewa is from a very sophisticated culture, whereas Will, who was an Englishman, is from a very, at the time, it wasn't a very well-developed culture at that time. So these are the two main characters in the book, Will and Ewa, okay? All right, so now at the start of every single story, we have what we call like the spark of the story. This is when things really kick off in the story, because until something like dramatic happens, something like dramatically changes, right, the story doesn't get moving. So we call this the spark or the inciting incident. There are a number of different words for it. So in a story like Harry Potter, for example, the story really kicks off when Harry finds out that he's a wizard. So then what happens is that his life changes. His life turns upside down because he finds out he's a wizard. In a story like Divergent, for instance, the main character, Beatrice, what happens is that she chooses a different faction or a different group to join than the one that her family's in. So her family are part of the Abnegation faction, and she joins the Dauntless faction. So her life totally turns upside down. So this is how really, this is when the story really kicks off. So in A Tudor Turk, you can see a map of West Africa there, and that's where the Songhai were. Now, in 1591, this great battle takes place. It's called the Battle of Tondibi. And what happens is that the Moroccan army comes through the desert, through the Sahara Desert, and it's about 30,000 Moroccan soldiers coming through. And they come to attack the Songhai nation and essentially try and take their gold and their resources and so on. Now, King Askia of the Songhai nation, he has mobilized like 80,000 soldiers with him. So there's 80,000 soldiers from the Songhai, and they're defending their nation against 30,000 Moroccan troops coming through the Sahara Desert. What King Askia also does is that he has 1,000 cattle, or cows, if you like, that he also brings to the battle. And the plan was this, that he said, okay, when the war starts, the battle starts, the cattle will go charging off into the Moroccan lines, and they will stampede through, and what will happen is that the Moroccan army will then get split, and will be distressed, and then we can attack, and we have superior numbers. We have 80,000, they have 30,000. It sounds like an okay kind of plan, right? But what actually happens is that when the battle starts and these cattle go charging off at the Moroccan lines, the Moroccans have cannons, which the Songhai didn't realize. And of course, when the cannons go boom, 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 the cattle, or the cows who have gone charging off that way, get terrified, and they turn around and they come charging back at the Songhai. And then the Songhai lines are completely scattered, and then the Moroccans come down and they defeat them. So when I read about that, I thought, I would really like to put a character at that point. What would it be like to be a character from the story in that moment? And so that's where Ewa's character comes in. So Ewa, we meet her in the second chapter in the book, and that's where she is. She's at the Battle of Tondibi. So that's where her life turns upside down. So any kind of story that you write, you have to think at the beginning, what's like the trigger? What's the event that will really spark the story, and it'll change the life of the main character? And that's what we call like the inciting incident or the spark. Okay. The other thing then, when you're writing a story, is sometimes you're going to think about different locations. So for example, when I went to Istanbul, if ever you have a chance to go there, you'll see has some incredible architecture, some amazing buildings and mosques and synagogues and churches and so on and so on. it's really inspiring. There's actually one architect, Ottoman architect called Sinan, and he actually built about 200 of the, iconic buildings around Istanbul. So when I went there, I thought, wow, I'd like to set a story here. This is another place, actually in Alexandria, and this is called the citadel of Qaitbay, and Qaitbay is in Alexandria. And this was a citadel or a castle that was built by the Mamluks, who were the rulers of Egypt, to keep the Ottomans out. I mean, the Ottomans defeated the Mamluks, but this was built by the Mamluks to keep the Ottomans out. Again, an amazing location to set some chapters in the book, and that's what I did. In A Tudor Turk, again, there are some chapters which are based basically in Alexandria at this place. Likewise, this is, has anyone been to Venice? Venice? No? Yep, okay, one person in the back. Venice is obviously in Italy, and this is a bridge there called the Rialto Bridge. Now, the Rialto Bridge was the first stone bridge in Venice. Before that, the bridges were built of wood. This was opened in 1591, and so my story is set in 1591, and I was a bit lucky that this bridge was opened in 1591 as well. And I put that in the story as well. Let's go. Okay, this is actually a very famous castle in England. It's called Leeds Castle, but it's not in the town of Leeds. It's actually in a place called Maidstone, which is in the south of England. And when I visited Leeds Castle in Maidstone, I thought to myself, this is an amazing moat, like water around the castle. And if you were trying to get in here, that would be really difficult. So I thought this would make a great location for having my villain. So the main villain in the story is a dastardly English earl called the Earl of Rothminster, and this is his kind of HQ. This is where he's based, right? I thought that would make a great location. And then this is a famous bridge in London. It's called London Bridge, but this isn't the original London Bridge, because the original London Bridge was actually bought by an American in the 19th century. So an American businessman bought the original London Bridge, and he shifted it to Seattle. And this is the replacement London Bridge, but this is the one that's there now, and they say it's London Bridge. But in the 16th century, London Bridge, the original one, was 7 stories high. So what they used to do, they had these old rickety kind of buildings going up the bridge, and they had beams going out to the side, and some of the buildings were supported on these beams. And they would put the heads, unfortunately, of criminals onto spears, and they'd put them on the top of the bridge, which is really quite nasty, really. And when I read about that, I thought, oh, that would make an amazing scene to have, like a chase scene in a story. So again, I put that in. I put London Bridge. I have my characters running across the top of these buildings in 1591 with all these tarred heads and everything else. Okay, so that's in the bridges. That's in the story. So location sometimes provides a great opportunity if you go to different places, and you can put that in the story as well. Okay, so let me go back then. Oh, actually, one more thing. Now, generally, when we write stories, quite often a lot of novels and like movies and this and that, they're based on something called the hero's journey. And the hero's journey is very simple. The way it works is that there's a main character who is living their life, everything is kind of fine and normal. Suddenly something happens, and a force of antagonism, something happens in their life, and it disrupts it. The main character then has to go on some kind of journey. They have to overcome great difficulty, adversity. Along the way, they meet like a mentor figure, a guide who helps them out. They face great difficulty. They lose the mentor figure, the main guide, their helper. And after much trial and tribulation, they overcome the difficulties they were facing, and they come back home. And that's really the hero's journey. That's pretty much how it's structured. And if you look at world literature, across the whole world, stories follow a very similar pattern. The very first story known to human beings is called the Epic of Gilgamesh. It's a Sumerian tale, which is basically today it's Iraq, it's in that place. And it's about a king called Gilgamesh. And it follows the same thing. It's the hero's journey. So he goes on this journey, has many difficulties, and then comes back home. All right. If you look at Chinese stories, I don't know if anyone's read The Journey to the West, which is about the Monkey King, who essentially comes with a Buddhist monk, and they travel from China to India to receive Buddhist scrolls, and then they journey back to China. It follows the same structure. It's the hero's journey, exactly the same way. If you look at Persian culture, the Shahnameh, which is the Book of Kings in Persia, exactly the same structure. All the stories follow the hero's journey. If you look in Indian culture, the Bhagavad Gita, again, very, very similar structure. Okay, and of course, then if you look at modern day Western culture, like The Hobbit, same structure. Hero goes on this great journey and then comes back. So the hero's journey is a particular structure which writers use generally. And next time you're watching a film or you're reading a story, think in your mind, is this following the kind of the hero's journey? And quite often it will be. Okay, so let me just now bring it back to something I said at the beginning. I said at the beginning that there's more written about the Vikings in Arabic than in any other language in terms of the primary sources. Okay, so what you find is that the Vikings, most people know the Vikings who went from Scandinavia and they went into places like Britain or England at the time, and they were raiders, they raided. But the majority of the Vikings actually traveled east. Okay, so they went from Scandinavia and they went down the river Volga. These were called the Volga Vikings. And they traveled down the river Volga, and they were known as the Rus. They were called the Rus. And that's where people speculate the name Russia comes from Rus, as does Belarus, which is another country, and people speculate the name comes from the Volga Vikings as well. So these Volga Vikings traveled east, and we're talking around about the 9th, 10th, 11th century. At the time, the greatest city in the world was Baghdad, or in Iraq today. And so these Vikings came, they originally came in raiding parties and traveling down towards Baghdad. They came up against the armies of the Caliphate and were completely destroyed. And so the Vikings put down their weapons and they became traders. And they started trading with the Arabs. They traded fur and honey in return for silver. So what you find is that in 10th century Baghdad, you have Vikings there, but they haven't come to raid, they've actually come to trade, okay? Now, in return, what happens is that a lot of Arab diplomats of the time, they then travel back from Baghdad, and they travel up into Scandinavia. The most famous of these was Ahmad ibn Fadlan. And Ahmad ibn Fadlan wrote a risala, or he wrote a book about his journeys with the Vikings. And until today, the only surviving account of a Viking burial at sea is written by Ahmad ibn Fadlan in Arabic, okay? So he writes about how a Viking chief is buried at sea. And the only reason we know that, so the chief goes out, all his belongings go out, and then they fire these arrows, and the ship is burnt, right? So you've probably seen that, like in a movie or something. But we only know that because that's written by Ahmad ibn Fadlan in his Risala, and he explains that. So there's more primary source evidence in Arabic about the Vikings than in any other language. There's a writer called Michael Crichton, and everyone's heard of him because you've heard of Jurassic Park. So Michael Crichton wrote Jurassic Park. He also wrote another book called Eaters of the Dead, and that's a story about Ahmad ibn Fadlan and his journey with the Vikings up to Scandinavia. And they made a really bad movie in the 1990s called The 13th Warrior, which was about the same thing. It was about Ahmad ibn Fadlan, but I wouldn't watch the movie, it's really bad. If you want to know more about this, then there's a great website, which is 1001 Inventions. And this is a site on there, which is basically about 1001 inventions from the Muslim world, which have gone out into different parts of the world. And there's a whole section on the Vikings. And if there are any adults or teachers want to know more, there's a really great BBC podcast on this called The Volga Vikings on BBC with Melvin Bragg. It's called In Our Time. That's a really good resource as well. And it explains this whole thing, right? So there you have a story about two very different people, Arabs and Vikings, and then there's shared stories that you build together. I also said at the beginning that in this cathedral in London, in Southwark Cathedral, which is just on the other side of the River Thames. I said there was buried there in 1736 a Native American chief, and his name was Mahomet Weyonomon, and he was chief of the Mohican tribe. Now, he came to London in 1736 because what was happening was that the settlers who went from Europe and England to America, they were taking the land of the Native American Indians. They were going there, they were taking the land. So he came to talk to the king and say, look, please, can you stop taking our land, right? We're happy to, accommodate you, but stop taking our land. The king refused to meet him. The king said, nope, not going to meet you. Not interested. Now, Mahomet Weyonomon and the delegation that he came, obviously they came to England because they had friends in England as well. There were English people who were their friends. They contracted smallpox and they died. Now, because he wasn't a Christian, they didn't bury him in London. They buried him outside. And at the time, they buried him in the grounds of Southwark Cathedral. Now, in 2006, Queen Elizabeth I, who is obviously the current queen, she opened a memorial for him, for Mahomet Weyonomon. So if you go to Southwark Cathedral, it's in a place called London Bridge. If you go to Southwark Cathedral and go to the back of the cathedral, you'll find that there's a memorial for him. So I went there, had a look. There's a memorial for him, Mahomet Weyonomon. And so the Queen honored him because, it might be 300 years late, but at least the Queen honored him and his descendants. And until today, there's actually a town in America that's named after him, Mahomet. It's in Illinois. It's a small town, about 30,000 people. But this is the most interesting part, okay? Mahomet is the French for Muhammad. Anyone who speaks French will know that Mahomet in French is Muhammad. So basically, you have a Native American chief in 1736 who dies in London, whose name is Muhammad Weyonomon. And there's a town in Illinois named after him called Muhammad. What's going on? How did that happen? Well, again, if you look at the history and you start understanding this, so what happened is that between 1500 and 1800, there were 12 million Africans were taken from West Africa, and they were taken as slaves to America. The majority of those West Africans were Muslims, and they were taken to America as slaves. Many of those West Africans then married Native American Indians. Okay, not many, some. Some married Native American Indians. They obviously had children. Their descendants, their names were Muhammad, Ibrahim, Mustafa, and so on. And you can go to the Library of Congress, and there's a lot of documentation on this as well. So potentially then, Mahomet Weyonomon, or Chief Muhammad Weyonomon, was a descendant from one of these marriages, right? And so he comes to London, and he's buried there as well. So the point is that these stories are all around us, right? And these are great sources to actually build, stories that bring us together as people rather than as, separating us. So I'd like to really leave you with this, which is that I think when you reach out and you look at the cultures and myths and legends of other people, then what it does, it will only enrich us. It only enriches us. It doesn't diminish us, okay? So that's the key message I'd like to leave you with, that, embrace other people's cultures because it will enrich you, it won't diminish you, okay? So I'm going to stop there. I'm going to ask for, we've got a microphone at the back, so if you have any questions about anything I've said, or maybe any questions about writing in general, then please feel free to ask. And don't be shy. Just needs one person to start the question. Okay, go on, ask.
Hello. That was a really amazing lecture. Thank you very much. You mentioned a journey. Does it need to be a physical journey, or can it be a spiritual or an internal journey that requires some transformation?
Yeah, it's a good question. So it could be a physical journey. When you go there somewhere, you experience from a sensory perspective, lights and sounds and smells of a different culture. but it could also be internal journey. There are many, many good books which are written about the internal journey a main character takes. So for example, one of my favorite books is called Flowers for Algernon. And Flowers for Algernon is a story about this man called Charlie Gordon. And he has a very low IQ of about 65. He goes through an experiment which makes him super smart, and his IQ goes up to 185. And then he's now so clever that he realizes that all the friends he thought he had were actually just making fun of him. Okay? And then in the story, eventually the experiment wears off, and then he becomes like he was again. Now that journey, that story, is all internal. It's the internal struggles of that character. It doesn't matter what physical location they were in, but it's there. So, you may want to choose and put your story there. So, I think when you're choosing to where to place your story, one of the things you have to think about is what type of conflict is taking place. Because as human beings, sometimes we have internal conflicts, so things that we do which create difficulty for us. Maybe someone talks too much, right? And people tell you, be quiet, they talk too much. Maybe someone gets angry very quickly, right? So that's conflict that they create. Sometimes then you have a circle around that, which is conflict created by the people that you know. Maybe someone's family is nasty to them, or their friends aren't very nice, And then you've got the conflict created by the environment around you. So again, the journey in the story depends where you put the conflict. Okay? Any other questions?
Hello. So, basically, I was asking about your
Just put the microphone
motivation.
down.
Basically, I was asking about your motivation for writing.
Motivation for writing.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's a good question. So what was my motivation for writing? So when I was like about 9, 10, I always used to like writing stories. And I wrote this story about one of my best friends whose house was burgled, right? These thieves came in, and what my friend did was that he built all these traps around the houses, and these robbers came in and they couldn't get through. Now, my teacher at the time, she was from Beverly Hills, California, so it sounds a little bit like Home Alone, right? Yeah, so I don't know, maybe she took the idea and it became a movie. But anyway, so when I was young, that's why I was really interested in writing. And as I got older and I went to university, I kind of stopped writing, and my passion for writing stopped. And then in 2009, when my daughter was 6, so my kids are 18 and 16, at the time my daughter was 6 in 2009, and she said to me at breakfast one day, she said, "Daddy, what do you want to be when you grow up?" A really cute thing to say, right, for a girl. "Daddy, what do you want to be when you grow up?" And I thought, oh, yes, what do I want to be? And I realized I wanted to be a writer, because that's what I always wanted to be. So that's where my motivation came, and that was 2009. So now, 10 years later, I've done 3 books. That's really where the motivation came from.
One more question.
Go on, another question.
So I want to ask about your first book. Was it a successful thing, or?
The first book?
Yeah.
Yep. Okay, so the first book I wrote was called Last of the Tasburai, which is a fantasy novel. And it was like a self-published book. So I got it, I put it out there. It sold about 2,000 copies, which is kind of okay for a self-published book. And then on the strength of that, then I got a publishing contract with a publisher for this one, which just came out actually end of February. So it just came out, yeah.
Last question.
Let me just check, is there any other questions though?
Is there any question?
Let this lady go here.
Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum assalam.
Basically, I'm a teacher at the school, and I would like to ask you, stories are best read or said or seen?
Okay, very good question. So obviously, historically, all cultures were oral traditions, right? And so you had to have great memories, okay? So some people learn by listening, right? Some people learn by writing. Like I learn by writing, right? Some people learn by reading. So we all have different ways of learning. And one of the most important things when you're a student is to figure out very quickly, how do you learn best? Because it'll be different from other people. Do you learn better by listening, by reading, or by writing? Ultimately, you still have to like revise your topic, right? but the way to learn is different. And so stories are effective in all three mediums as well. Yeah, a lot depends, obviously, if you're listening to a story, how good is the storyteller at telling the story as well. Yeah. Any other questions? There's a question just here.
First of all, thank you for your great and fantastic session. I would like to, not to add, but to mention that if anyone wants to build his experience or passion of writing stories, he were like a child. He has to listen, to have experience, to look around him, from the nature, people, whatever he's there. Because nowadays the generation are focusing on themselves. They are not listening. They are not passionate to do something. Technology maybe is like lead them for that, or their families, parents, community. I don't know why, but there is elements around them. But for us, I'm learning, and I'm passionate to learn. I learned a lot today, and I hope everybody come and listen to others and listen to each other to build our own experience. Otherwise, it will be no more stories, no more experience, nothing we will share together. But I hope from all, and you can, sir, add to my point.
Thank you. No, you're absolutely right, because I think as a storyteller, first you're a reader. So before you're a writer, you're a reader. You have to read, and you have to look at other people's stories as well. And I think one of the challenges that we, as adults and as teenagers, that you face as well, is not to be distracted, right? Because modern technology, it's designed in such a way to distract you, right? To constantly distract you, take your brain from one thing to one thing to one thing to one thing. And if your brain is always receiving, then it's not actually growing, right? You learn when you give your mind a rest. That's the best time to learn. Ask yourself, often you're having a shower, you're walking somewhere, and suddenly an idea comes to you, right? Yeah? Why does that happen? Because your brain is resting. When your brain is resting, that's when the best ideas come to you. So if you always fill your mind with going from one device to something else, to something else, something else, then you won't necessarily learn. Okay, I better stop. The time's up. I could keep talking, but if you want to ask some questions or something, I'm here. We're signing some books as well, so feel free. So thank you so much for coming, and thank you for everyone in the room for organizing it.
Thanks, everyone, and thanks.